Spring of 1880 came hard to White Rock, Wyoming. The wind had a voice of its own, dry and cracked, like a throat too long without water. It scoured the plains until the earth gave in and dust lifted into the sky, dimming the sun. Out on the edge of town, past the last leaning fence posts and the mule-worn tracks, a wagon sat motionless. The horse had collapsed some miles back. The wheels had been dragged by hand after that, the ruts behind them shallow and crooked. A woman stood beside it now. Her shawl was too thin for the cold. Wind pressed it flat against her frame. Her hands gripped the side of the wagon, not from pain but from resolve, knuckles stiff, fingers red. Behind her, inside the wagon, two children lay curled beneath a quilt faded to the color of bones. They did not stir. They had not eaten since yesterday's bread was divided. One was coughing now and then, the other sleeping to still. Her name was Claire, though she had not heard it spoken kindly in weeks. Her husband's voice had been the last to say "it's awfully," and his grave was 2 counties back, hastily marked beneath a cottonwood stump. Fever had taken him first, and the farm second. That came faster than rain ever had. Clara stood in the road, the wind tugging her skirt sideways. She looked ahead. White Rock shimmered faintly in the midday light, a cluster of buildings too proud for its size. The church spire pointed straight up into a pale, ruthless sky. She did not expect kindness. She expected to be seen and passed over. People had their own troubles. She lifted the oldest child in her arms, a boy not yet 10, and walked toward town. Each step on the hardened earth felt like lifting her feet from glue. She had buried pride with her husband and was past shame. There was no choice left. An old dog barked somewhere in the town's edge. A screen door creaked and slammed, but no one came forward. She stopped at the steps of a storefront, unsure what it sold, unsure she'd be allowed in. The bell above the door didn't ring. When she opened it, someone had taken it down. A man behind the counter glanced up, paused at the sight of her, and said nothing. "I need work," Clara said. "I don't ask charity, just a place to stay for the night, and something to feed my children." The man turned away. "Try the church." The door closed behind her with a whisper. She walked to the next place, and the next. Each time, her voice got quieter. Each time, she held the child closer. Her legs trembled, but she kept moving. It wasn't until the last place and out buttling behind a livery stable that someone stopped her. A woman with sleeves rolled and hay clinging to her apron came out with a ladle and dipped it into a pot. "You from South?" she asked. Clara nodded. The woman didn't ask more. "Child looks bad. Come in for now." They stepped inside. The smell of stew was enough to make Clara's stomach twist with want, but she waited while the children ate first. Only after they were asleep again, wrapped in a wool blanket on the floor, did Clara let herself sit on the ground beside them. Her eyes burned. Her hands shook. Outside, the wind howled against the boards. Inside, it was still. For the first time in days, she closed her eyes without fear. She did not know that a man had watched her pass earlier from the far end of town, a man leaning against a post with a limp in his step and a past as heavy as hers. But he had, and he was thinking. That night, sleep did not come easy. The floor was rough, and every creak of the wind against the boards sounded like a knock. Clara lay curled beside her children, listening to the small rhythm of their breath. The boy still coughed now and then, his chest hitching, the sound sharp in the stillness. She laid her hand across his back and rubbed gently, more for herself than for him. The barn loft held the scent of old straw and horse sweat, but it was warmer than the row, and safe enough. For now, she stared up at the slats in the ceiling, each one holding back the cold night sky, and thought of the house they'd left. A clapboard place with a broken porch rail and a stovepipe that never stopped leaking. But it had been theirs. Her husband, Eli, had put in the fence himself, dug the holes by hand, with sweat pouring off him and mud up to his knees in springtime. They built it together after the war, both too young and too sure. Hed come back thin but smiling, with a scar down his side and a mind full of plans. It hadn't lasted. Farming in that stretch of Kansas meant praying for rain and getting locusts instead. 2 years of failed crops had turned hope into debt, and debt into a man with papers and a badge. When the sickness came, Clara had known he wouldn't survive it. She had seen death before, seen it in her mother's face, and then again in the mirror after Eli was gone. The worst part was losing him. It was how quickly people stopped looking you in the eye afterward. She had left the farm with what she could carry. 1 skillet, 3 quilts, the photograph of her wedding day already worn to a ghost of its former shape, and the children. That was all. White Rock had not been their destination. She had heard of a cousin out in Montana who might help, but the journey there was too long. Too far to walk, too much winter left in the wind. She shifted on the floor, careful not to wake the girl beside her. Ruth was only 6. She still asked when her father would come back, and Clara had stopped correcting her. A bird creaked above, probably just the building settling. Still, Clara rose. She moved across the room, barefoot on the wood, and looked out the low window. The town lay quiet, lit by a pale sliver of moon. At the far end of the street, someone sat alone on the steps of the feed store. A man in a wide-brimmed hat, a cigarette glowing faint in his hand. He sat still, back hunched slightly as though deep in thought. She couldn't see his face. Clara didn't know why she noticed him more than the others. Maybe it was the stillness. Maybe the way he watched the road, not like he was waiting, but like HED already waited too long. She stepped back from the window. Tomorrow, she'd find work or she wouldn't. Tomorrow, she'd keep going or she'd stop. But tonight, she still had her children close, and a roof above them, and that would have to be enough. Outside, the moon inched past the clouds, pale as milk, soft as memory. If the dust stayed with you, subscribe and return. By morning, the wind had died, leaving the air hushed and heavy. A gray stillness settled over White Rock. Clara rose before the children stirred. Her back ached from the floor and her legs cramped when she stood, but she didn't let it show. She shook out her skirt, brushed the straw from her sleeves, and stepped outside. The town looked different in daylight. Less harsh, maybe, but not softer. Like a face that showed its true age once you looked close. Horses tied to hitch posts snorted steam. A boy ran past with a pail sloshing water. The woman from the night before, Martha, she'd said her name, was already busy feeding chickens behind the livery. She gave Clara a nod but didn't say much, just handed her a piece of cornbread wrapped in a towel. Not much, he said, but it'll hold you till dinner. Clara murmured thanks. She returned to the barn, handed the bread to the children, and told them to eat slowly. Then she stepped out again. She needed work, needed something to hold them here a little longer. She passed the general store without looking up, the memory of being turned away still hot on her skin. She turned toward the feed store, instead the place where the man had sat the night before. As she approached, the door swung open. He was coming out, a sack slung over his shoulder, walking with a slight limp in his right leg. Up close he was younger than she'd expected. Mid-30s maybe. Weathered. Hair dark, eyes unreadable. He stopped when he saw her, didn't move aside, didn't tip his hat. "You're the widow," he said. His voice was rough, but not unkind. Clara stiffened. Clara." He nodded slowly. "Saw you coming yesterday. Thought you did keep walking." "I would, love," she said, "if there had been anything left to walk toward." They stood in silence a moment, her hands folded tight in front of her, his resting loosely at his sides. "You looking for work?" he asked. "Yes." "What can you do?" "Cook, mend, clean. I've driven wagons, helped with calving when I had to." He squinted, not skeptical, just measuring. "You strong enough for all that?" "I buried a husband," she said flatly, "and carried 2 children across 2 counties. You tell me." A faint twitch crossed his mouth, not quite a smile. He shifted the sack on his shoulder and gestured down the road. "I got a place east of here," he said. "Small ranch. Don't keep much stock anymore, just a few head and stubborn land. Could use a hand for a few weeks. Not much pay. But there's a spare room. And my cook left last month." Claire looked at him hard. "Why offer it to me?" He shrugged. "Reckon someone gave me a chance once when they didn't have to." He turned, started walking. After a few steps, he looked back. "Well," Clara hesitated. She thought of the children in the barn, the cough that hadn't left her son, the silence in town. Then she followed. They walked without speaking, boots crunching over frozen mud, past the edge of town and out into open country. The prairie stretched wide, broken only by a few wind-stunted trees and the soft rise of hills in the distance. The ranch came into view slowly, a house with a slanted roof, a barn with one door hanging loose, and fence lines that leaned like tired men. He opened the gate and let her through. "What's your name?" she asked finally. "Jonas," he said. "Jonas Gore." She nodded once, and for the first time since her husband's death, Clara stepped over a threshold that didn't belong to a stranger. The house was plain, weathered silver gray from wind and sun. Inside, it smelled of dry wood and something old left to rest, perhaps loneliness. Jonas set the sack down near the hearth, then stood awkwardly, scratching the back of his neck. "You'll want to look around. I cleared the room upstairs. Has a cot and a stove. Not much else." Clara nodded. She removed her shawl, shook off the dust, and folded it neatly over one arm. "My children," she said. "They'll come with me." Jonas gave a single nod. Of course. He showed her the room. The mattress was thin but clean. A wash basin sat in the corner. She touched the stove's iron surface. Cold, but whole. She imagined the quilt spread here. Her son's small body crawled near the wall, Ruth clutching her doll. That afternoon, Clara brought them over. They walked quietly beside her, wary but calm. Jonas didn't speak, just held the door and stepped aside as they entered. He had cleared the pantry shelves, left a bucket of fresh water. There was a crate of eggs and a slab of salt pork on the counter. "You'll cook," Clara said. "Suit yourself," Jonas replied. They worked side by side that evening. She boiled potatoes, cut them with steady hands. He mended tack near the fire, his fingers rough in practice. No wasted motion. Occasionally she caught him glancing her way. After supper he stepped outside without a word. She found him near the corral, leaning on the rail, smoking. "You don't talk much," she said, stepping beside him. "Nothing worth saying most days." "Doesn't mean there's nothing worth hearing." He gave a dry sound that might have been a laugh. "Maybe." He turned to her. "You know horses?" "Some. Got a mare with a cracked hoof. Farrier's not back till Monday. Could use another pair of hands." "You'll help," she said. And she did. Each day after, she rose before dawn and stoked the stove. She learned where he kept the tools, how he liked his coffee boiled long, no sugar. She scrubbed floors, patched old shirts, cleaned out the chicken coop with a handkerchief tied around her face. She never asked for thanks, and Jonas, without saying so, began to rely on her. He taught her how to brace against the wind when riding out past the ridge, how to read the weather in the shift of the clouds. She watched the way he moved, slow but deliberate, a man who carried loss without letting it break him. One afternoon, as they gathered hay in the lower field, Ruth sat on the fence, humming to herself. The boy Samuel stood nearby, his boots too large and his jaw set firm as he helped lift bundles. "You've done right by them," Jonas said quietly. Clara looked away. "I've done what I had to. Same thing, far as I can tell." Later, in the stillness of the house, Clara found a book on the shelf by her bed. A Bible, worn and underlined. Inside the cover, in faded pencil, was the name Annie Carr. She ran her fingers over it and closed the book. Jonas never spoke of her, but when he came home late that night, eyes tired and boots muddy, he paused in the doorway and said, almost too softly to hear, "You can stay as long as you like." It wasn't love, not yet, but it was trust. And in Clara's world that came first. Snow came early that year. By mid-November, the hills were white and the wind cut sharper than before. The chores grew harder, slower. Clara's hands cracked from the cold. Jonas offered her his old gloves, worn soft at the fingertips. She took them without a word, folded them twice, and wore them daily. The children adjusted to the rhythm of the place. Ruth learned to sweep without being asked. Samuel shadowed Jonas fetching tools, watching how to tie rope and calm a skittish horse. He spoke more now, though never loudly. Then the letter came. Jonas found it in town, stuffed in the rusted mailbox outside the Mercantile. He held it for a long while before tucking it into his coat. Clara saw him reading it by lamplight that night, jawed-eyed, the lines around his eyes deeper than usual. He didn't speak of it, but the next day a man arrived. He came up the road with dust on his coat and a badge on his vest. A lawyer, or something like it. Eastern boots, clean nails. The kind of man who didn't belong out here but thought he owned whatever he stepped on. Jonas didn't shake his hand. Clara watched from the window, heart beating hard. Voices rose, not loud but sharp. In silence, the man rode off, leaving Jonas staring after him, his face unreadable. That night Jonas sat at the table long after supper, bottle in hand. "It was my brother's land once," he said suddenly. "Half of it. He died 6 years back. Widow never made a claim, so it's a lawyer says someone's bought the note. Once the boundaries were drawn. Once the pasture." Clara stayed quiet. "Could fight it," he said. "Might lose. If I do, I lose half the herd. The winter stock. Everything tied to this place." She watched the fire crackle. "What will you do?" Jonas looked at her then. Really looked. "Don't know. Depends what's worth fighting for." In the days that followed, things shifted. He pulled away without meaning to. Grew quiet. Spent more time in the far pasture alone. Clara felt the distance settle in her chest like frost. She questioned herself in those silent hours. Wondered if she was another weight dragging him down. His shed stayed too long. One morning she found her children dressed and sitting at the table before she rose. Samuel had packed their things into the sack they'd arrived with. "I heard you talking," he said. "If we need to go again, we can." Her heart nearly broke. That night she stood at the fence where Jonas often sat. He came out late, hands tucked into his coat. "You're pulling away," she said. "Done." He didn't look at her. "I don't want you caught up in this." "We already are," she said. "You think we don't know what losing feels like? You think walking away will keep us safe?" Jonas looked at her then, eyes raw. "I don't know how to let someone stay," he said. "Then learn," she said. "Or lose us like everything else." Took off his hat. Nodded once. It wasn't a promise. Not yet. But it was the beginning of one. The next week brought word from town the new landholder was arriving. A cattleman out of Denver, sharp in contracts and quicker in court. Jonas didn't wait to be summoned. He rode in early, boots muddy, coat worn, and papers under his arm. Clara wed with him. She didn't ask, he didn't stop her. They sat in the back of the courthouse, Samuel and Ruth beside them, silent as stones. The man who claimed the land sat ahead, sleeves starched, hair slicked, speaking in that slow, polished way of men who'd never lived in the places they owned. He called Jonas stubborn, uncooperative. Said he'd failed to maintain claim over his half of the land. Showed maps, cited old deeds. The judge listened, nodding impassive. Then Jonas stood. He didn't speak fast, just laid it out. His brother's death, the unfiled probate, the cattle grazed by hand and fence, the labor poured into that soil year after year. He passed the judge a record book, names of sales, weather notes, winter losses. The judge glanced through it, unreadable. Then Clara stood. "My husband is buried in Kansas," she said, voice steady. "He worked land like that. Same dust, same sweat. I buried him with my own hands. Then I brought our children here. Jonas gave us shelter, food, dignity when we had none. I've worked his land, mended his home, seen the truth of what he owns not just in paper, but in the work it took to keep it." The judge looked at her for a long moment, then said he'd decide by end of week. Outside, the wind had picked up. They stood on the porch, watching it stir dust across the street. "Did I help or hurt?" Clara asked. Jonas looked at her, and something in his face eased. "You reminded them I'm not alone." They returned to the ranch. The days passed in tension, but not silence. They worked, side by side. At night, Clara sat with him by the fire, the children asleep upstairs, and they spoke of things neither had ever said aloud. He told her about Annie, his wife, lost in childbirth 6 winters back, buried under the cottonwood near the corral. "I thought if I didn't speak her name I wouldn't feel the empty," he said. Clara laid her hand over his. "Grief doesn't get smaller. We just grow around it." When the news came, it was in a single sentence delivered by a career boy too young to shade. Claim upheld. Land retained. Jonas read the line 3 times, then set the paper down. In the yard, Samuel whooped. Ruth danced barefoot in the cold grass. Clara just stood there, the wind in her hair, watching Jonas as he looked at her. He crossed the yard in 3 long strides, took her hands, held them like something sacred. "You should know," he said. "If I make you stay, it'll be for good." She smiled. "Jonas Gar, I've stayed through worse than love." They kissed, plain and honest, beneath the wide sky, the smell of wood smoke and horse sweat around them, the sound of children laughing close by. It wasn't the end of their troubles, but it was the start of something stronger than either had known alone. Winter held the land fast, but something warmer had settled inside the house. The days were full now, mending fence, feeding stock, hauling water when the pipes froze. Clara rose first, always. Jonas was never far behind. They worked like they breathed, without ceremony, but always together. One evening, while snow drifted soft against the windows, Jonas pulled a small bundle from the mantel drawer, unwrapped it slow. Inside was a narrow gold ring, plain undone shine. "It was my mother's," he said. "She didn't have much, but she kept this through every dust storm and lean year. Gave it to me the day Annie and I married." Clara didn't speak. He turned it in his fingers, then looked at her. "I want you to wear it, if you're sure." She didn't cry. She just nodded once. "I've been sure since the day you didn't ask me to leave." They were married quiet, in the small white church just past the southern rise. Martha stood witness, the children close on either side. No choir, no crowd. Just hands held, vows spoken low, and a sky so blue it felt like spring had come early. They planted a tree behind the house that week. Jonas dug, Samuel carried water, Ruth picked the spa. Clara laid her hand to the sapling's thin trunk when they were done. "Something to root us," she said. Jonas stood behind her, arms around her waist, warm breath against her neck. "And grow," he said. By the time the thaw came, Clara was showing. She moved slower but with more steadiness, as if her body had learned to carry both grief and joy in the same breath. The ranch changed shape. A new fence line. A barn repaired. Inside the house, her cradle sat folded on the chair. A pair of boots, small and unwarm, waited by the hearth. At night, after the children were asleep, Jonas would read aloud from the same worn Bible. Sometimes she'd rest her head on his shoulder. Sometimes he'd fall asleep mid-sentence. But always they ended the day with the fire low, the air still, and the sense that nothing needed to be hurried. Outside, the prairie stretched far and wide, as untamed as ever. The land hadn't softened. Life hadn't either. But something in them had. And when Clara stepped outside one morning, hand to her growing belly, watching her children chase each other through the cold grass while Jonas mended the porch, she knew this was the place they had landed. It was a place they built together. The West never tells just one story. Subscribe.